Yeah, we are super excited for the talk today. We have Dr. Laura Thomas Walters today here talking to us about her research on activism. She's the Deputy Director of Experimental Research for the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and Research Lead in Extinction Rebellion, UK's Data Analysis and Insight Circle. Exactly. So for me, I think you can start, Laura, if you're ready to share your screen.
Great, thanks all. I'll just get my presentation up. Great. Can I just get a nod if you can see this?
But we don't see the full screen yet.
No, that's fine. Great. So really happy to chat to everyone today. I'm going to be talking quite broadly about climate activism, the research that I've been doing on it, about choosing effective tactics, and particularly about mobilizing new activists. As mentioned, I work at the Yale program on climate change communication, doing lots of messaging experiments and things like that. For the past few years, I've also been a volunteer research lead in XR UK's Data Analysis and Insight Circle. So we set this up, gosh, pre-pandemic, which feels like a very long time ago now, with the goal of being able to produce research that would be useful for other circles within XR UK and, you know, more broadly as well. So if other circles like messaging and media or actions or strategy have questions, they can come to us and we can either see if there's an answer already out there in the scientific literature, or we will sometimes perform our own primary research to find an answer. So a lot of the research I'll be talking about today was done as part of XR UK DAIC. And I'm hoping, I think there might be quite a few scientists here, so, you know, or even non-scientists, you know, I'm hoping I might come away with a few new recruits for the circle. And of course, I am also a climate activist with XR generally myself. I can't see the chat as I go, so if there are any like really relevant questions, I don't mind if people butt in, or Mayan, if you can like let me know if there's something I should answer like straight away. So, as I said, we've been going for a few years, so we've done a lot of research and I can't possibly cover it all. So what I thought I'd do is let people choose. So there's one argument I do want to make at the beginning, an argument for disruption, but then I put together slides for 5 different research projects we've done. And if people want to write in the chat, I think I can probably cover 2 or 3, maybe 3 of the projects. So if you write in the chat what you'd particularly like to hear about, and I'll like cover those ones. And I'll tell you a little bit more about each one later on. So I'm going to start off on a hopefully not too controversial note here about disruption. So this has come out of, the argument making has come out of a paper that was just published earlier this month with Kevin Young, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Amherst. He's a historian who studies climate, social movements more generally, like the labor movement, the civil rights movement, etc. And we started talking about the role of disruption in climate activism after the We Quit statement that happened last year. I'm assuming most of you are very familiar with this, but if not, you know, January the 1st, I think it was last year, XR UK came out on social media and everyone, they, you know, made a big announcement, we quit public disruption. Not we quit entirely, but we're not going to disrupt the public anymore. And this caused quite a big fuss on social media. So you had like people like Insular Britain and Just Stop Oil who responded to this with, you know, like, well, we don't quit, we're not going to stop disrupting the public. You know, XR's argument, the strategy is informed by some of the research that I'll might be talking about next, which finds, you know, that shockingly the public doesn't like disruption. Who would have thought? And it came from the point of view of XR wanting to try and win majority approval, you know, to try and get people more sympathetic with the movement. Whereas Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, their position was more, approval is a big step away. We need to get their attention first, like unless we do these big flashy stunts, they're not even going to be listening to us. We need to do these big things to get into the media so that we get public attention. And there's a bit of a fuss and like lots of, journalists and things swaying in either side. And my sort of view and Kevin's view was both of those arguments slightly miss the point. Unfortunately, public attention versus public approval is the wrong metric to be using. What's more important than winning public approval is disrupting elites, the elite decision makers. So this paper that we wrote argues that what we really need to be doing is looking at the power structures that support the fossil fuel industry, that support the government, and creating, direct costs that would affect the economic bottom line to try and create political change. And I want to be very clear that this is about political change. It's not about individual level behavioral change, in which case public attention, approval, blah, 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 it's very important. And this disruption needs to be sustained to create real costs, and it can encompass, a really wide range of tactics.
Can I ask? So in the chat, someone asked, what are direct costs? So
one of the examples we drew from is the 1963 Birmingham campaign in the civil rights movement in Alabama. And this was an excellent example of a really well-organized social movement that imposed direct costs on elite decision makers. So they did lots and lots of different things, like they did organized boycotts, sit-ins, all sorts of things that were really directed towards the white businessmen, the white business owners down south. Unfortunately, the government did not care too much about what Black people wanted. But when the rich white businessmen, were being so disrupted that, there were financial costs happening to their businesses, that's when the government started to listen. And there's quotes from, his name has escaped my mind, but he was the director of the Chamber of Commerce and a real estate mogul, who said that he was, he's still an avowed white supremacist, but he would be foolish not to listen to the anti-segregation movement because it was affecting, businesses so much financially that he'd be foolish not to support them despite being an avowed white supremacist. When it comes to the climate movement, I think we need to be looking at things like insurance companies, which I know that we are now beginning to. There's a big insurance, a week of insurance actions that will, hopefully be happening soon. The legal system, when I see things like this in the news about top lawyers, coming together to say they won't prosecute peaceful climate protesters. The new workforce, you've got students organising campaigns to get fossil fuel companies banned from recruiting on campus. This sort of thing is really, really encouraging, and in my view, is the way to go. Of course, and I think XR scientists have done a great job of this in a lot of respects. One area of weakness is in whether or not it's sustained. The Cut the Ties campaign, for instance, is a great idea. Doing like lock-ins and things with people like Eversham Sutherland, the big law company that does a lot of defending of climate criminals and taking out injunctions against climate protesters. But it'll be, one day, or the thing against Barclays, it's one day a month and then nothing. And I think that's not enough to actually be affecting their, their bottom line, to creating an actual, change the cost benefit analysis of, does it make more sense to support the climate movement, or are they able to keep ignoring it? And so with that in mind, a lot of the other research we've done has focused on how to mobilize new climate activists. We need more people. And that is the exception to the public approval doesn't matter so much. We do need to recruit new members. When there is general support for climate activism, there's a poll last year, I think it was, found 2/3 of the UK public support direct action to protect our nature. But if you look at EXA's membership, for years it's been stagnating at around 170,000 people, which is like 0.25% of the population. And those are just the people who signed up to the sort of email list. Most of these people aren't going on to take action. So with that in mind, my sort of view on overall strategy, I'll turn now to the specific research that we have done. So there's 5 possible things. I'm hoping I could cover maybe 3 of them. We're looking at barriers. We did a big survey looking at barriers to climate activism. We did an online experiment looking at what sort of narratives would get people to attend the big one in the UK. We looked at online messaging, both a qualitative and quantitative way, and we've also done a study of media coverage of climate actions in the UK. Could anyone chime in with, are there any things that have been particularly popular in the chat? Is there anything that people particularly want to see?
Well, now the most popular is barriers.
But I just launched a poll
nice.
also, so I think people.
Oh, great.
And then we just take the top 3 or something.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
There's also a question.
Hey, yeah, I was just wondering, are any of those relevant? I mean, how much you could generalize any of the topics there to beyond the UK? Yeah, whichever one that would be, I'd be interested in that.
So all of this was done specifically with the UK. I think it's likely to be generalizable, but with scientist caveat hands-on, I can't say for certain, but I think it is likely. There might be some exceptions, like the stuff around in the barriers thing I'll mention, if people really don't like disruption, stuff like that. I mean, France is really great at organizing really disruptive strikes and taking to the streets and stuff like that. Maybe people there will be a bit more amenable to that sort of thing. So there might be exceptions, but I think it's hopefully relatively generalizable. It looks like barriers, narratives, and media coverage are particularly popular. So I'll talk about those. If we have time, we can go back to the online messaging stuff. Oh, is there a hand up? Or is that a legacy hand?
A legacy hand. Legacy
hand, okay. Right, so this is one of the first bits of research that we did, and this actually went on to inform the EXA UK's We Quit strategy. Working with researchers at LSE, London School of Economics, we did a nationally representative survey of about 1,100 people in the UK. This was quite a big piece of research. I think we still haven't even finished analysing all of the data, but the bit I'll talk about, we looked at intentions to take collective climate action generally. We also looked at revealed behavioural engagement of XR. So we measured this as a boundary variable. So we use something called prolific academic, which is a way that you can pay participants to take part in your research. So people expect to be paid, but at the end we said, would you volunteer to answer some more questions that will help XR, but you won't get paid for this. So that was our behavioural engagement outcome. As well as a range of qualitative questions and questions about people's attitudes, norms, etc., and past behaviour. This was designed using the social identity model of pro-environmental action. I won't get too deep into it, but basically we think that whether or not you do pro-environmental behaviours, in this case stuff with XR, is likely to be influenced a lot by whether you identify with XR itself or as an environmentalist, if you think that other people who are similar to you will also do the same sort of thing, if you think that you'll be effective together, it's bringing in these sort of variables. So we thought when we started the research, we thought that whether or not someone would act on their collective action intentions would depend on if they identified with XR's group. So if people said, you know, yeah, I would totally do collective, I totally intend to do collective action, we could then give them a chance to engage with XR. It'll depend on how much they identify with XR. And further, we thought that this interaction would be explained by if people believe that XR is effective and that other people would behave similarly. So we first needed to establish whether there actually is an intention behavior gap. You know, in social science literature, there's lots and lots of research showing that people often have great intentions and often do not follow through on those intentions. So there is a big gap between what we say we're going to do and then whether we actually go and do that. So we thought we should check here. So we classify people by whether or not they had intentions to take collective climate action. So were they inclined or disinclined? And then we looked at their past environmental behaviours with XR. And I want to say this was a very broad and generous definition of behaviour, like just liking it on social media or wearing a badge. You know, I don't mean like marching down in a protest, but doing anything slightly positive to do with XR, we would classify, you know, very, very broad. And we see that like half the group are what we'd call inclined abstainers, the people who have, say, they totally would do action, but actually haven't done anything in the past. So, you know, we want to know what explains that. So when we analyze this data, this might look a little bit complicated, but I'll explain it. We find that collective climate intentions do predict whether or not they then did the behavioural engagement with XR. So people who said that they intended to do climate action in the future were then more likely to do the task for XR when we asked them. So far, so straightforward. However, that was not predicted. That relationship was not moderated by whether or not they identified with XR. So there's no relationship there. There is a direct effect of identifying with XR. So people who say that they identify with XR are more likely to then do something with XR. But the relationship between intentions and behavior was not explained by how much they identified with XR. So you then also don't see, you know, you also don't see moderation from the norms or the belief in collective efficacy either. So that's not what we expect to find. But like I said, there is a direct effect of identifying with XR that is important in its own right. So we did look at other predictors of social identification and things like past environmental behaviour, your self-identity, perceptions of XR's image. Interestingly, not how effective people thought XR was. That wasn't important. I mentioned we also collected a lot of qualitative data. So we asked open text questions about what do you, let me just double check this. What do you support XR's cause and actions in A? What comes to mind when you think of XR? And in your opinion, what are some typical characteristics of an XR member, which is C and D, separated into positive and negative? And I'd say the majority of people, you know, did approve of XR, said relatively positive things, but about half of those would go, you know, I support the cause, but not the actions. And when, you know, asking about the actions, they bring up disruption a lot, and there's a lot of negative attitudes towards disruption, disruption aimed at the public in particular. It was about equal split in terms of whether they said positive or negative things about XR members. You know, that the strongest positive things are like passionate, strong, determined, versus selfish, stubborn, opinionated on the negative side. we had some other qualitative questions as well. So we asked about, like, what are your barriers to taking part? And the biggest thing that would come up would be sort of time and having other commitments that get in the way. But something interesting that I saw was that there seems to be a strong perception that the only way to be involved with XR is by taking part in a protest. So people would say, well, I get social anxiety in big crowds, so I can't go to protest, or I live in Scotland and the protests keep happening in London, or I'm here on a visa, so I can't get arrested by taking part in a protest, or I've got family commitments, so I don't have time to go to protest. That sort of thing kept coming up a lot. So I think that is a big misconception we need to fight, that there's lots of ways to support XR other than taking part in a protest. Like, for instance, this research was funded by Professor Ganga Sridhar at LSE, because she is a big believer in XR, but is on a visa and can't get arrested taking part in a protest. But she funded this research. It's really valuable research. I was part of the DAIC for several years doing research before I actually went and attended my first protest. The people who provide back office support when there's a possibility of arrest, those people are incredibly valuable, and we'd be lost without them. Admin people, or the people who do onboarding, but there's lots of ways to support XR without directly taking part in protests. I think that's something that that misconception definitely needs to be challenged. Are there any questions directly about this research, or shall I go on to the next one? And we can also do questions at the end.
There was one question, whether you can explain the link between belief in collective efficacy of XR and taking action.
If I can,
I think it's the model.
Yeah, so there was no direct effect of belief in collective efficacy and taking part with XR during the action, which was also surprising. Generally, belief in efficacy, that something will have an effect, is usually a big predictor, but there was so much stuff around disliking the actions and disliking disruption stuff that my personal explanation is that I think it's likely people's belief about whether or not it's effective is overwhelmed by their dislike of the actions. That people might think, yeah, XR might be effective, but we just don't like what they're doing so much, it is not going to sway me.
Yeah,
that's what I think. And to the question about the colours, nothing is just decorative. The colours mean nothing there. Okay. So I think the next one is climate narratives. For anyone unfamiliar, in April last year, there was a great big protest that took part in the UK outside Parliament Square. It lasted multiple days. The big one, the aim was to have 100,000 people attend. I think we fell short of that, but it's still a very impressive turnout. I've seen estimates around 60,000. I'm not sure how accurate they were, but there was a lot of people there. And not in about January or February of that year, we were asked, what sort of narratives, what sort of messaging is going to get people to attend this? What sort of messages should we be putting out to get people to attend the big one? So we did an online experiment with nearly 6,000 UK adults. We presented them with one of 11 different narratives. So this is what it looked like. The main thrust in bold at the top: we must end all new licenses and funding for fossil fuels. A few bullet points around it, and then there's a qualitative portion where we ask people to reflect on whatever we'd talked about. And this is a list of narratives. So these were drawn working with other XR members, and what are the messages that are currently being used and what could be helpful messages. So from the importance of citizens' assemblies, cost of living crisis, biodiversity, government corruption, fossil fuel lobbying, talking about how many lobbyists and how much money they give to it, social justice, green jobs, NVDA works. We had these 11 different narratives, and we're not trying to test specific wording, but more just the narrative as a whole. So we told people about the big one, and then we asked them 4 outcome questions. So how willing would you be to attend it for multiple days, invite a friend or family, and also defy the new Policing Act, which gives the police board powers to limit the freedom to protest. And I think by this point, that's now the old Policing Act, and we've probably got even more laws in place that are limiting our freedoms. I don't think it's in the slide, but we'll say, I think it's the majority of people said that they'd be willing to defy the new Policing Act, which I was pleased with. So our standout narratives were NVDA, non-violent direct action works, government corruption, health and mortality, and just climate impacts generally. Creating green jobs and economic benefits performed the worst across the board. So all the other narratives were compared to that one to rate their relative effectiveness. I wasn't entirely surprised that the green jobs one performed worse. I think there's definitely a group of people that will work for green jobs, but those people aren't the ones who are likely to be willing to take to the streets outside Parliament. We're not getting the majority of the public out there. We're getting the tofu eating, Guardian reading wokerati, who's going to be attending. So what was nice was having the qualitative data. So we were able to get loads of quotes from people and how they felt about that narrative to help inform the messaging that we then used afterwards. So, quotes like, currently the government aren't prioritising climate change. I do feel that climate change as an issue gets dismissed or pushed to one side. It's real, it's affecting the whole world, and they need to do more. Though I will also note, I do remember another quotes, quite a few quotes saying that the government prioritises it too much and they're taking too much action on climate change, which I would disagree with. Climate deaths and health issues was another well-performing one. And again, we had plenty of quotes from that. The fossil fuel lobbying, how politicians are being influenced by billionaires and oil companies, and quotes, and NVDA efficacy in the quotes. So I won't go through all of the outcomes because there are a lot. I will say that there's a public slide deck which has all of the results in, and I'll mention where you can find all of the research at the end, actually. So overall, 8% of people answered it, so they were very extremely willing to attend. And what we ended up doing was, instead of looking at overall impact, so which could include someone moving from extremely unwilling to just very unwilling, we looked at what made someone move from into the very willing and extremely willing category, because it's only these people who are the most likely to go. And again, it's NVDA, corruption, health, and climate impacts. And you can see the percentage.
Can I add something about this?
Yeah.
Because this is about a legal protest, right? The big one was legal or not?
It was legal, yeah.
So it's interesting that people that believe that NVDA has high efficacy, that they then are more willing to go to a legal protest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was a lot of communication about the fact that it was going to be safe and legal. There's a big focus on that in the communications around it. Willingness to invite a friend or family member. We just have like 2 main ones, which are the climate impacts and particularly climate impacts. Worked really well there. We looked at reasons for attending. So they could select up to 3 reasons why they might attend, and this is like what the very extremely willing to attend said. So mitigating the risk impacts, tackling the energy cost of living crisis, ending the fossil fuel era. So note that, you know, tackling the energy and cost of living crisis was one of the top selected reasons, but when it came to the narrative, that didn't move as many people as some of the others. And again, we had qualitative data as well. So we asked, you know, what would you like to see from the protest? I would encourage you to attend. And the big things coming up were those peaceful, safe, well organized, that it would have an impact, that lots of people would go and there'd be a clear agenda. And we've got quotes, you know, that a clear commitment to peaceful protesting would most encouraging me to attend, or plenty of journalists and reporters invited, lots of media coverage. Because we had such a big sample size, we were able to do audience segmentation. So we were able to look at like what certain groups of the audience thought. So like liberals are more willing to attend than just the general population, unsurprising. And climate impacts coming up really well. When it came to defying the law, actually social justice did the best there, which is interesting. Conservatives, none. There were no important narratives with conservatives because there were just so few of them who said that they'd be very likely to attend. So we can't look at any differences amongst the narratives there. We looked at by the level of climate concern. We looked at by membership of different NGOs, so like what Greenpeace members versus the RSPB versus the National Trust members, which I haven't put all that on here. We also looked at social media users. So what messages, what narratives are likely to work well, you know, on different social media platforms. So like climate impacts work well on Facebook and Instagram. NVDA efficacy working really well on YouTube. Climate impacts on Twitter again. Health and mortality for TikTok, which is interesting. TikTok's a younger generation, and we're seeing some differences in the narratives that work well there. And so this wasn't published, but it was shared widely within XR and was then used to, inform to develop the messaging that we use to promote the big one on different platforms. I'll pause there in case there's any questions specifically about this research. If not, I'll go on. So we're going to skip the qualitative stuff. So media coverage. This wasn't directly done with XR. This was funded by a grant from the University of Brown Climate Social Science Network, where we decided to have a look at the media coverage that surrounds different climate actions in the UK. So we wanted to understand, how does media coverage vary based on the legality, the scale, and the target of different actions, looking both like coverage, so how much is written about it, and the sentiment. So for instance, we suspected that legal actions would be written about more positively, but illegal actions would get more coverage. So we recorded all coverage of XR in the top 15 UK newspapers by circulation and the BBC over a period of 7 months, I think it was, 7 months. And we classified actions in terms of various things like legality, scale, target. As I mentioned, we've got various hypotheses here. This is like pre-registered. Most of this research was pre-registered beforehand. We'll go straight into it. Shockingly, conservative papers are more negative when they write about climate activism, and not that surprising. There is something to mention here, which is, I'm going to keep saying like more liberal papers were more positive, or whatever things got more positive stuff. Almost the whole of it was still negative. When I say more positive, I just mean it's a bit less negative than the other stuff. Okay, that's something to bear in mind. So yeah, more liberal papers report more positively, but it was still negative overall. It was just not as negative as the conservative papers. And we find legal actions, so contrary to what we suspected, legal actions actually got more press coverage, and that coverage was more positive. So like I said, we thought that it would be more, that illegal actions would get more coverage, but that's not true. Legal ones did. And we were quite surprised by that. And so we, yeah, is there a hand? Or question, Camille?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I was just wondering whether here you control for how big the action is, because I can imagine that the legal actions usually are much bigger, and therefore maybe they might get more press coverage.
Yeah, so that's a great, yeah, that's a great thought. And so that's something that most of the actions were about the same size, except for the big one. The big one was kind of the outlier in terms of the actions that were reported on, which is why we then thought, what if we drop coverage of the big one? How does that affect it? And we then find there's no correlation between legality and coverage or sentiment if you don't include the big one. But we also thought, so I'm not sure how many people are in the UK, but in the run up to the big one, there's a lot of coverage specifically because of the marathon. The London Marathon was going to be happening on the same day as the big one. And there were lots of fears that, you know, would the big one interfere with the London Marathon? And the, you know, XR was very, very clear that they'd, you know, arranged this protest in advance with the police and everything, and they made sure that there would be no disruption to the marathon. Although Just Stop Oil came out and said they weren't committing to not interfere with the marathon, that they were holding back that option to do or not. So there was a lot of coverage over this, and it was actually pretty positive in favour of XR, particularly with the organisers of the London Marathon, you know, saying like, no, XR have been very clear. 1 second, my cat is definitely eating something she shouldn't be. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, she's running. So we then thought, what if, you know, we keep the big one in, but we remove the marathon, anything that mentions the marathon, with a theory that, you know, we can organise another big one. We can organise, I mean, it's a lot of work, but we can organise more big ones, but it'd be really hard to replicate the effect of the marathon coverage unless we like deliberately set up, you know, a protest at the same time as some other big popular event and then goaded another group into saying they might interfere so that we could say we weren't going to, you know, like it'd be really hard to replicate what happened there, basically. So if we include the big one, but not the marathon coverage, we go back to no difference in the amount of press coverage, but legal actions do still get more positive coverage. So there is some nuance there depending on what sort of coverage you include and don't include. But one thing you can say is illegal ones don't get more coverage, which is what we would have suspected, but we find no evidence, no way that you slice it, that, you know, there's more coverage for illegal actions. Initially, we wanted to include public reactions, so like shares and comments and things like that, but we were missing data, probably that only 15% of the newspaper articles included that sort of data, you know, allowed comments or reported how many times things were shared. So we just looked at press coverage as a sort of proxy. You know, it's not ideal, but we're looking at sort of the number of words, the coverage now, and looking at in terms of legality, scale and target. And this is something I don't think I mentioned this when we were looking at the barriers research, but another thing that came up is there's a lot of confusion amongst the public about who the different groups are. You know, that people were mentioning, I didn't like when XR glued themselves to the M5 or whatever, and we're like, well, that wasn't XR, that was a different group entirely. And we see this with the media as well, that a lot of the times XR would be mentioned, but it's actually a different group that's done the action. So you can separate all of the coverage that's just talking about climate actions generally to the coverage just specifically about XR actions. And if you do that, we find the same patterns amongst it. It's just the XR one is a bit underpowered. It's a small sample size, so it's not it's not powered to detect differences, but the patterns are the same. And we're finding here legal actions get more coverage. London focused things get more coverage. More coverage. Shocker, everyone loves London the best. Industry focused actions, things that target industry, like Barclays, for instance, which is a bank, they get more coverage. And both conservative and liberal papers write more about XR actions than do neutral ones. We also decided, we also thought we can actually have a look at accuracy as well. So we coded how many errors were made. And we find that conservative newspapers make more major factual errors than neutral or liberal papers, which I shouldn't be smug about, but I am a little bit smug about that. We also looked at the mean sentiment of articles before and after XR made the requit statement. We're wondering whether after XR said, publicly that they're not going to disrupt the public anymore, maybe people start writing nicer things about them, which didn't happen. There's no change in sentiment amongst the articles focused on XR. We also had a little case study. So there were 3 actions that happened around the same time. We had the big one. We had the Grand National, which is a big horse racing event that Animal Rising interrupted, and snooker championship, which is a snooker championship that someone from Just a Boil interrupted. And we looked at the total number of articles, the total word count of the articles, and the mean sentiment of the articles. You can see the mean sentiment for the Grand National snooker was more negative compared to the big one. The word count of the snooker was comparable to the big one, although the Grand National definitely got more words. And number of papers, articles was roughly comparable. So that was a lot, but just to summarize all that, we've had strong evidence that liberal papers do report more positively and more accurately about XR actions. But the requit statement did not significantly change how positively people wrote about XR. The impact of the scale, the target, legality of actions and press coverage, it depends if you include the big one in the analysis or not. If you do include it, you get legal actions get more coverage. If you don't include it, legality doesn't have an impact. So yeah, that it was a big driver. I'll stop here if there's any questions specifically about this bit of research. I'll have a quick look in the chat.
Yeah. So one question was whether the more positive sentiment about XR was because the Just Stop Oil threatened to stop the marathon, if this was not just due to a radical flank effect.
Yeah, I would say that. It was, like I said, it was the fact that Just Stop Oil were refusing to say that, they sort of said they might disrupt it, and that created a lot of fuss. And the director of the London Marathon was, very positive about XR in the paper, saying like, well, XR have said they're not going to do it. So it reflected well on XR, and it improved the coverage, which is why we tried one of the analyses without the marathon coverage, because that might be hard to replicate in that way.
Then there was a question on how you measured mean sentiment in the study.
So that was manually done by we had a PhD student who rated them all on a scale from -1 to 1, I think, and all of the coding was then independently verified by someone else from the DIT who wasn't really involved with the whole thing, but went through the coding and verified it as well. Just because I'm aware of time, I'll pause there for a minute just to do the conclusion, but there will still be some time for more questions. So just want to say we've got lots of ongoing work, including stuff on other countries. So we're currently doing an interesting project looking at the effects of tactics and target on public support and intentions to take part in climate activism with George Mason University. There's an ongoing impact evaluation of the big one. We're going to start doing some research around onboarding pathways. We've done a lot about attitudes to citizen assemblies. We've done lots and lots of research. And I don't know if you can still see this. Can you see my screen, or are you still on the right? So my website, I've covered a lot of the research we've done, and it's got links to journal articles or public slide decks if you want more details, or if I don't have them there, you're welcome to contact me for details. The first one I talked about, the barriers, that's being written off as a paper, is currently under review. The disruption one has been published. Narratives, there's a public slide deck that you can look through, and the media coverage one has just been accepted as a paper. So, do go to the website if you want to see more of the research we've done. And like I said, I've not covered all of it because we've done loads. I'd love it if anyone wants to join the Data Analysis and Insight Circle. We're always desperate for new members. There's loads of research we wanted to do, but we have a big capacity problem. So is there any, and you don't have to be a social scientist by any means. I think I'm the only social scientist who's actually a member. So, do not let that put you off. And I mean, I would usually put in a plug for scientists for XR here as well, except I think most people here are members of scientists for XR, so that's great. And yeah, I'll pause there if there are any questions. I'll stick this in the chat, actually, the website link. Yeah, any questions? Peter? Peter?
We cannot hear you. So maybe Troy, you can go first.
Sure. Just wondered if you'd come up with any conclusions or suggestions from your study on how most effectively to get the media to tell us the truth. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish. I really wish. I actually think, going back to the first thing about disruption and targets, I actually think maybe we should be targeting the media more. I mean, I know we have done things, but again, going back to that, sort of sustained escalating disruption, because yeah, the media has a huge influence on what people believe that other people believe, and on what the government believe and do. I know journalists did an interesting study near the start of the Ukraine-Russia war, when the UK government brought out a sort of an emergency energy, not bill, but policies of what they're going to do. He looked at what the public supported in terms of policies and what the media said people supported, which were very different. And yeah, everything the media wanted ended up on the bill. Only one thing the public wanted ended up there, and it was something the media did also support. So yeah, I think the media should be a much, much bigger target. Peter, are you able to talk?
Is this working now?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. And one of the comments that I frequently get, I'm sure many people here do as well, is that when you get negative press, does that generally act against our interests. Does all of that press work against us rather than work for us? How would you respond to a question like that from
So,
a member of the public?
I don't really think so, because again, going back to the point, I don't think that public approval has a big influence on achieving political change. What does matter is, putting off potential joiners. But the people who would potentially join us are probably not the people who are reading the Daily Mail anyway. And I mean, taking a step back, obviously we need significant lifestyle changes from everybody, but just in terms of XR actions and political change, it is more the people who are already sympathetic to climate change issues who might read The Guardian and not the Daily Mail. And so I think it's more important, that we come across as reasonable and diverse and people that they could identify with, people like their friends and family. So I think representation is really, really important. But the overall press landscape being negative, I'm less immediately concerned about. If you look at like the suffragettes, there was so much negative press about the suffragettes. They were absolutely lambasted. Same with a lot of the civil rights movement and things like that. But they were successful. Yeah, Nicholas?
Hi, thanks so much. This was a really great talk. Happy to have the time to be here. My partner is also a social scientist, so this was really cool to be a part of. 2 questions for everyone. I know we had to skip over the qualitative stuff. I was just wondering if those slides could be made available. And I'm not sure if you can tell from my accent, but I am not from Europe. I'm actually checking in from New York. So really happy I could be a part of this. And was wondering if you guys have heard about the group Climate Defiance, because they seem to be also targeting what you guys are have been discussing in this talk, where taking it away from the public and doing more direct actions towards what I call movers and shakers. Like, they've been going after federal representatives, they've been targeting people in Biden's cabinet. So I was wondering if you guys had any familiarity with them. But thank you so much for this talk and for your time today.
I don't know any of them, but I think what they're doing is really cool. I have emailed them to say, if they want any help with research on any of this, I'd love to be part of it and do like some impact evaluations or anything, because I think what they're doing is awesome. Although I don't know any of them and they are new, but I think what they're doing is really awesome. I'm so sorry. I think the qualitative stuff. Yes, so that's on the website. I'm very happy to send these slides for these slides to be distributed afterwards. I'm totally happy for all of this. And then if the slides don't answer any questions, because obviously they're just an overview, I'm very happy to answer any questions by email or anything like that after. But these slides can be shared.
Okay,
Jessica? Jessica?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great to listen in. I'm calling in from Canada, and I guess I just would like to know, I find, maybe it's COVID, but I find it's really easy for me to learn things and then forget them. So I wanted to know, what is your top takeaway from what you'd like us to take away from this work that you've done?
I think it would be focus less on the public, focus more on elite decision makers. That's the number one thing I wonder, right? Rather than worrying about if the public approve, think about when you plan an action, like a public march down the street. Who's being inconvenienced? Who's that targeting? What's it going to change? Or if you plan something, make sure that you've got a defined target in mind that are going to be greatly inconvenienced and that they can then do something about it. I think that would be, and keep it up, sustain that. That would be my number one thing. Or recognizing that to sustain it, we need more people. And so diversity and representation is really important.
Just to follow up on that, I think that's really great. I think my next question would be then, if we're not focusing on the public though, then doesn't that affect turnout in terms of like who we might then draw into the movement?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. Because you can do things that are still visible without being directed at the public. You know, things like all the Barclays, they're a big bank who fund a lot of fossil fuel exploration in the UK. You know, things that have happened to them, those bank branches are usually in a public place. So people see it happening, even though it's not about the public. And indeed, things that are aimed at the industry received more media coverage than did other type actions aimed at the public, for instance. So I don't think that does necessarily close us off from attention.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate all this.
No worries. I know we're over the time limit, but yeah, any other questions, or if you want to call it there.
So there are some in the chat. One is about the discrepancy of 8% of the population in your study saying that they are very or extremely willing to join, but then only around 0.25% of the population actually joining. So do you have an idea of what we can do to activate the remaining 7 to 8%?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to what I said earlier about the intention behavior gap. People are always so good at saying, yeah, I'm going to start a diet, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm not going to eat cake, I'm going to give up smoking. And then how many people actually follow through with all that, right? But, you know, I think it's really, I think it's super encouraging that so many people did say that they're really very extremely willing. And yeah, I would, there's often debate within the movement on like whether we should like try and mobilize everyone or we should just focus on specific people. I think we should focus on those very willing people. I think, you know, getting them to actually get off the couch and come and do something, you know, is hard enough without also trying to, you know, persuade everybody else as well. And we don't need to persuade everybody else. If that 8% of people who said they were very extremely willing actually took to the streets to take actions, like that would be enormous, you know? So I think those people who lean liberal, who care about, I'm thinking of people like my sister, my brother-in-law, you know, who read The Guardian and vote Green Party, but have never done an XR thing before. Those are the type of people that we should really focus on trying to mobilize. There's one question I would like to answer that I've just noticed about any tips for setting up a data analysis insight circle outside the UK. It would be fantastic if every XR or every, you know, action group did have a circle like this. It took us a long time to get going. I'd say it took like a couple of years for us to start being used. Like you know, we were new, people were a bit skeptical. The most important thing is doing the research that's answering the questions that the other groups want to answer in the way they want answered, and not what you necessarily think is best and most interesting yourself. Like, we didn't get into it, but the qualitative quantitative thing about online messaging, it was the community circle came to us and they wanted to know how to get more people to attend their community talks. So I wanted to do an online social media messaging experiment. I thought that's the best way of doing it. They were terrified by all the like words that we're throwing out and, you know, all this, and they're like, can't we just do some interviews? So we did the focus group work, and the focus group work was still useful, and it informed, you know, other things, but it made them see the value of research. And they then came back to us and said, okay, you know what, that first thing you proposed, we're willing to fund that, let's do it then. You know, we proved our worth first. So yeah, it might take a while. I also really had a really good EC, external coordinator, who was fantastic at persuading people. You know, I did most of the science, but he was the one who then took the science and like made everyone else listen and see the value of it. He was invaluable, you know. Johanna?
Yes, I may have missed this, but are there any studies? I haven't been able to find studies comparing the different effects of different types of disruptive actions. So the studies I see compare, right, like legal protests to disruptive actions, but never disaggregate disruptive actions targeting public versus elite. So I'm wondering if you have any data on that or know of such studies.
No, but I'd love to. I think there's a huge dearth of impact evaluation that's happened, a huge dearth of it. And I mean, I understand why. Like I said, we've been doing I've not been very involved, but the rest of the team have been doing an impact evaluation on the big one, which is just one event that happened last April, and that report still isn't finished yet because it's so much work to do. So comparing multiple different actions, you know, so much work. But I really feel it is important, and that we need to start doing that, you know, even if it's, you know, just like more qualitative work. Yeah, we need that sort of research. We are doing some research, like I said, about the impact of different types of actions and targets. So like blockading versus throwing paint versus marching are aimed at different people, and their effect on public support for policies and intentions to join. That's not the same as whether or not they then achieved political change, of course.
Yeah, fitting with this, there's a question in the chat asking about whether you've ever measured the impact of XR in terms of climate policies or other social justice impacts.
Nope, but would really love to. And I'm just trying to think of, I read something recently. Yeah, I just read a paper recently that was in the US, which looked at the effects of like climate movements generally, and they found that both the combination of like institutional growth and actions, like setting up more and more movements and engaging with politicians and things like that, and disruptive stuff like protests and things like that, the combination of both of those led to more environmental bills being passed. Each of them on their own was important for getting on the setting the agenda, but the combination of both of them is what helped lead to more bills being passed, I believe. It was a very interesting paper, but that's the only paper that I've seen at all that sort of looks at it in terms of policies, actual policies and things. And yeah, if anyone wants to do that sort of research, please reach out. That would be great.
Thanks. There are two more questions. One is whether you have any data on the difference between actions with distinctive uniform professionals, like Scientist Rebellion, Right Goes in the lab coats, or doctors and nurses going in their work uniforms. Have you ever seen anything about this having an effect?
Though I do know that even when you do have uniformed professionals, you know, sometimes people think you're just dressing up. You're not actually doctors. They think you've just borrowed a lab coat. I mean, it is borrowed a lab coat, but you know, they still don't think you're actually professionals. But that would be really interesting to do. And on that thought, you know, I've also been thinking, I've noticed more of a trend towards anonymization with protesters, you know, like wearing masks and not giving names, particularly in the UK, because the laws are getting so bad here. And I wonder what that does to the credibility of like the movement. I mean, I understand why people want to be anonymous, but I do wonder whether it undermines our credibility if it's perceived as, you know, we're not willing to put our faces or names behind actions, you know, how worthy are they type thing. And I think that'd be a really interesting line of research.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe one last is if you have any best practices for setting up and evaluating, no, I missed it, impact.
There's loads of really good research on like how to evaluate impact. Like there's loads of really good guidelines out there, guidance already. I will say that I think with a lot of the research that we've done, a lot of the type of actions that we do that are qualitative theory-based approach is probably best. Like we don't just want to know if something had an impact, but why and how, or if it didn't, which, you know, might be the case a lot of the time, why didn't it? What sort of facilitating conditions would we have needed to have seen an impact instead? So I think taking, yeah, a theory-based qualitative approach to evaluating impacts, which can combine different data sets, you know, things like interviews with stakeholders, media coverage, interviews, surveys of passers-by and attendees. This is all being combined in the evaluation of the big one, though it's a lot of work.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else? Maybe one more question? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Laura. This was super insightful. And yeah, if you want to become more active, you are very welcome in Scientist Rebellion as well. Maybe Fabian can share a link. We are active in more than 33 countries, I think, in the UK as Scientists for XR. So yeah, you are very welcome.